Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for this presentation of Buried Treasure, Exploring Your Family History Collection, sponsored by the Clearwater Aging Well Center. Your family history collection consists of all of the things that your family collected and passed down over time. Things such as birth certificates, letters, photographs, and other objects. There's a lot of things that can be learned from the items contained in your own personal family history collection. Things such as who, when, and where, the names of the people, where they were located, and when certain things happened in their lives. Some you may be very familiar with, and some you may have never even heard of before. You may learn, what did they wear? Or what did they eat? What affected their lives? Generally, people only hold on to something that has some meaning for them. By going through the items in your collection, you can discover what was important to the lives of your ancestors. You may find out things such as where did they travel, or what was their social status? Were they relatively well off, or were they struggling to make ends meet? Who were their friends and neighbors? Just as we do today, our ancestors had connections to people other than their relatives. So as you go through the family history collection, some of the names that you see and some of the people in the photographs are not necessarily going to be relatives. They could be friends, neighbors, co-workers, extended family members such as in-laws, and other people that your ancestors interacted with. In this presentation, we're going to look at 4 major categories. Although your ancestors may have left other types of items in your collection, these 4 categories are typical of the type of item that you're going to find. Things such as official documents, family documents, photographs, and heirlooms and other objects. When I talk about official documents, I mean things that were issued by various types of government agencies, whether they be local, county, state, or federal. Often these documents have to be held onto for a certain period of time in order to prove something later. So you'll very often find these types of documents in your collection. Things such as birth, marriage, and death certificates, deeds or other land records if your ancestor owned property. You may be able to find tax records. At first, this may sound boring, but it can be a fascinating look at the lives of your ancestors to see what they were being taxed on and how much they had to pay. And taxes, just like today, could be at almost any level of government. You may find legal documents, anything from divorce papers or court cases that your ancestor was involved with, to things such as a power of attorney or will, or even a traffic citation. If your ancestors were immigrants and became naturalized citizens, chances are good that they held on to the paperwork to show that they had become citizens of the United States. With that document, you may be able to find out things such as where they came from, when they arrived in the United States, and maybe even what ship they came over on. You may find military records. If one of your ancestors was in the service, particularly if they were in during wartime, they would have held on to those documents in order to get military benefits later. And you can see things such as what rank did they hold, and maybe even where they served. If your ancestors traveled overseas, you may find a passport. Even our immigrant ancestors who became naturalized citizens often returned back to the home country at some point in their lives in order to visit relatives, and maybe even to bring one or more back with them. Just as today, our ancestors had to acquire different types of licenses. You may find things such as a driver's license or a business license. You may even find something such as a dog license or a vehicle registration license. There can be many different types of family documents in your own collection. These that I've shown here are just a few of the more common types, but there may be many others that you yourself have in your collection. Things such as letters and postcards. And if you're lucky, even diaries and journals can be fascinating to read the thoughts and activities of your ancestors. You may find different types of notes or receipts that were held on to. You may find certificates, diplomas, and different types of awards. These can be a really interesting way to get to know your ancestors and what their lives were like. It's common to find newspaper clippings. I like to call newspapers the Facebook of their day because many of the newspapers, particularly a smaller local newspaper, talked about all of the comings and goings in town. They would talk about who had someone over for dinner or who was traveling out of town and where. You name it, and they talked about it in the paper. You may find funeral cards. Just as today, our ancestors went to many different funerals. But always keep in mind that some of the people mentioned in these cards may not be relatives. As I mentioned earlier, they may be friends or coworkers, neighbors, or other people that your ancestors associated with. You may find different types of church records, such as a church membership or a baptismal or christening record. The documents shown here on this screen are some that are in my own collection. The one is a poem that my second great-grandmother wrote in 1911 that she dedicated to George, her second husband. The other item shown is a rent receipt from 1890. For some reason that I don't know about, one of my ancestors decided to hold on to this particular rent receipt. And it was fascinating to learn that a house rental for a month went for only $8. Just as we do today, our ancestors loved having their photographs taken or collecting photos of family members and other people who were important to them. So photographs are often part of your family history collection. You may be able to find photos that follow family members at different stages in their lives. You can see how they changed as they got older. You may often find them in front of their homes or their businesses. An example is the photo shown here on the top. One of my great-grandfathers owned several businesses over the years, and he loved to have his photo taken in front of each of his different businesses. You may be able to learn more about the occupations of your ancestors. Examples are the two lower photos shown here. The one on the right is a great-grandfather who for a time was a streetcar conductor, and this photo shows him in his uniform. The photo on the left is someone who worked in a factory. And by the way, this is George, the one that I talked about just a moment ago, whom my great-grandmother wrote the poem for. In photos, you may be able to find things such as places that your ancestors visited. You can see how they dressed. This can give you clues about their social status and maybe their cultural ties. For example, quite often our immigrant ancestors had some of their earlier photos taken while they were wearing clothing that represented their cultural background. All of these photos represent people and places and things that were important to our ancestors. These photos are an example of how you can see what someone looked like at different stages in their lives. These photos all include one of my great-grandmothers. The one on the top left is her as a girl. The lower one that you see is her on her wedding day. On the top in the middle is her some years later with her 3 children. And the photo on the bottom right is one of my favorite pictures. This shows 4 generations of mothers. The little girl on the right is my mother when she was young. The woman standing on the far left is her mother, my grandmother. And the woman standing in the middle is my great-grandmother, who's shown in the other pictures as well. So you can see how she changed over the years, but she still had distinctive features, and you're able to recognize who she is. The woman standing behind her and my own mother is her mother, my second great-grandmother. By the way, the woman who wrote the poem to George. Your family collection may include heirlooms and other types of objects that have been passed down. For example, shown here is my grandfather's World War II medal and his dog tags. You may have various types of jewelry or items of clothing, such as a wedding dress. You may have watches and clocks, such as the traditional grandfather clock. Remember that in the past, timepieces such as these often were quite expensive, and many people, when they were able to afford such items, acquired them almost as a status symbol to show that they had been successful. You may be able to find the family Bible or other books that have been kept by your ancestors. And be sure to keep an eye out for cookbooks and recipes that they collected. You may be able to find souvenirs from different places that your ancestors visited or events that they took part in. These can be a really fun way to learn more about the lives of your ancestors. They may have collected baby items such as toys or little booties. They may have passed down items of furniture, such as a wardrobe or a hope chest. These are a few examples from my own collection. This chair, according to family legend, has been passed down from a Revolutionary War ancestor. This is my grandmother's high school ring and a lock of hair from one of my mother's first haircuts when she was a little girl. I'm lucky enough that one of my grandmothers painted, and she liked to paint portraits of the family members at different points in their lives. So I have a whole collection of her paintings. By the way, this one is me. You may also find many different types of souvenirs. This is an example of one that my grandmother kept from when she was about 12 years old. It's a booklet of tickets for the electric streetcar that she took back and forth to school in the days before school buses. Once you've gone through everything in your own family history collection, then try to learn more about your ancestors. For example, talk to your relatives, especially the oldest relatives before they're gone. Find out what family stories they know about that you may never have learned. Contact your cousins. Find out who has what. Often, when an older relative passes away, the items that they've collected from the family are distributed to different members. So over time, different lines of the family have different items that you may never have even seen before. An example of this are the two photos shown here. A few years ago, I was in contact with a second cousin that I just met. She had a photo of one of our common ancestors that I have never seen before. The top photo is a document which lists the 11 children of this ancestor. It shows their names and their dates of birth and death. Also read history and travel books to learn more about the time periods in which your ancestors lived and the locations where they were. If you can, track down old newspapers. They may have articles that name your ancestors, or at least talk about the things that were happening in town when your ancestors lived there. If you're able to travel, visit the historical museums near where your ancestors live to get a better idea about the community in which your ancestor was part of. If at all possible, try to visit various family history locations. It can be a great experience to literally walk in the footsteps of your ancestors. For example, all four of these photos are houses of some of my relatives. These are all photos that I took myself when I visited. Everything from the photo on the top right, where my mother grew up, to the one on the bottom left, which was a house that my 11 times great-grandfather built in 1648. On behalf of myself and the Clearwater Aging Well Center, thank you so much for joining me today.